Hello and welcome to the Literary Lair, and to another Patreon-sponsored review. Though this time, it's the first one we're doing for a book. And, as if to commemorate the occasion, the patron chose a book that is definitely not in my wheelhouse. So, this might not be apparent, but despite only being 21, I'm not really hip with the kids. Wasn't when I was a kid, and I'm still not. So my musical tastes are rather eclectic. I mean, I admitted just 2 weeks ago that Power Rangers theme songs are on my personal Spotify playlist. Now, you might be wondering what the hell that has to do with today's review. Well, that's because the book we're looking at today is Grey. Not that one! Today's book comes to us from Pete Wentz, who, if you're a fan of the emo punk scene of the early 2000s, you'd probably know from his music career rather than his career in the literary world. Pete Wentz is the bassist, lyricist, and backing vocalist for the band Fall Out Boy, who, if you don't know who they are, well, neither do I really. I only really know them from what other people who are fans of them have told me about them. The only songs of theirs that I really know were Sugar We're Going Down, Thanks for the Memories, and Uma Thurman. The first two because the Game Grumps referenced them in a few playthroughs, and the last one because, as we saw 2 Octobers ago, they sampled the theme song from the Munsters for that song, and so I know about it because of that sampling. Anyway, enough about the fact that I managed to completely bypass the emo punk scene, and more about the book. You might be wondering what type of book a member of a punk band would write. Is it a sci-fi drama? Is it a noir detective story? It's a story about a member of an early 2000s emo punk band. Well, they do say write what you know. I jest, but I would have loved it if this book was like a total departure from what you'd expect from him. Regardless, this is the book he wrote. I don't have much else to say for an introduction, since I don't really have a history with the author, and really just saying that the book was written by the guy from Fall Out Boy basically covers it. I mean, I know that there are 4 guys in that band, but whose picture pops into your head when you hear the band's name? Anyway, is his debut novel any good? Or should he stick with his day job? Let's find out. This is Grey. The cover is gray. I presume that it's a grayed out view of Chicago due to the fact that Pete Wentz is from there and the book takes place there for a good chunk of it when it isn't taking place in LA. It's relatively par for the course cover, but it's minimalist in a good way, in that it's dynamic. I also dig the title. It looks all decayed and splattered, sort of like a painted wall on the side of a building that's old and peeling. It's definitely the best cover I've ever seen associated with a book with the title Grey. It's also interesting to note that Pete Wentz didn't write the book all by himself. He did have help from James Montgomery, who, as far as I can tell, is a writer for MTV News. So I'm not sure if that's going to impact the book at all, so let's get to it. The story is told in a stream-of-consciousness type way, as the narrator, heavily implied to be Pete Wentz himself, as far as my interpretation goes, details his life in the very specific scope of his relationship with an unnamed woman, only referred to as her. Huh. So does that mean that Joaquin Phoenix was playing Pete Wentz in that movie? So, this is sort of different than our usual clear narrative fare, so I'm just going to quickly summarize the major points, since there's more to talk about with the other categories. The story, as I said, details the narrator's life in regards to his on-again, off-again girlfriend and to his band, formed in the Chicago area, getting extremely popular and going to California to make their first album. But only if they can stop pranking Gustavo. Yeah, I don't really have a lot of music knowledge, so that's about the only joke I have. Though it is sort of relevant since Pete Wentz did do a guest spot on a Nickelodeon show with the lead actor of Big Time Rush. I can't really go over it chronologically because it jumps around with flashbacks and the like, so allow me to try to get the plot relayed to you as concisely as possible. The story centers around the unnamed narrator, much like the one from Fight Club, now that I think about it, especially in the writing style. He starts the book by recounting a story about spending a night with some girl at a hotel in California before he starts to feel nostalgic for her. Throughout the book, we find out a lot about her and the narrator's relationship. How they met, she had known of him when his band was starting out in Chicago, and had went to a bar specifically hoping that he would show up, and did a routine with her roommate of ditching her to go home with the narrator when it was her plan the entire time. They start dating soon after the event. He currently attends Columbia, but his band is starting to gain traction, which is good, and they got the attention of a label who wants them to record an album at a studio in Madison, Wisconsin. But her isn't happy about that, since it means that the narrator will be away for a long time recording and she wants to be together. And, as we find out later, she doesn't quite share the narrator's optimism about the potential that his band has to strike it big. Most of the book details his band's rise and subsequent move to Hollywood as the label is impressed by their first album, their first tour, and the narrator's thoughts and feelings about the band, the tour, and his still burning feelings for her. The narrator's band makes it big in Hollywood. But he also starts abusing drugs due to his anxieties and also because of his unhealthy obsession with her. They break up and get back in contact during the tour over email, with a lot of strain on the relationship even then. They break up again, and when he comes back into town for a show and he gets her backstage access, he finds out that she brought a guy with her. Awkward. He blows up and she ditches the guy and goes home with the narrator, but it's clear that it's a one-time thing because he freaks out and ditches her before she wakes up and leaves town without saying goodbye. That proves to be a mistake, as not soon after he gets a call from her roommate that she was in a car accident that left her in a coma. She had apparently been driving drunk and hit a guardrail. He has them cancel the rest of the tour and rushes back to Chicago to be with her, and she passes soon after, with him taking a degree of responsibility because he feels that she was driving to be with him. And soon after, the narrator attempts suicide via sleeping pills in his brother's car. He manages to retain enough cognitive ability afterwards to get himself to a hospital, and he survives. He recovers, and life goes on. He goes back on tour, seeing all of his fans, and the novel ends with the narrator telling us that he thinks he saw her ghost one night when he was sleeping. Yeah, I don't actually know how to play piano. We'll be right back. And we're back. What? It's the only song I know how to play. So we have three major characters in this book that a lot of time is dedicated to. That's the narrator, her, and John Miller, the disaster. Not to be confused with the disaster artist, because that's a completely different crazy weirdo. I didn't really talk about the disaster much in the summary because most of his actions in the book are as a sidekick to the narrator, and it wasn't really important to the major overarching plot of the narrator and her. The narrator is the most developed because we know his innermost thoughts and anxieties. We're there in his head as he breaks down several times in the novel. I gotta commend Wentz for that. I don't suffer from anything remotely like that, but I feel that I could empathize with the narrator and not just sympathize, and there is a distinct difference. It's written in such a way that he feels almost like a real person, which does convince me that this was at least partly autobiographical, because even if you're the greatest writer of all time, it takes experience to write something like this. Her is also really well written. Despite the fact that we're hearing this all from a retelling, she feels just as present as everyone else. Neither of them are healthy. The relationship is bad for both the narrator and her, as is apparent from the first few chapters. But, I was rooting for them. I wanted them to get better. I wanted her to finally accept his dreams, and I wanted him to accept her back into his life. It's strange, considering how obviously incompatible they are, yet you can't help hoping that something good will happen to them because of all the bad stuff that actually does happen, and how much the narrator talks about actually loving her when things were going good. Her death was disappointing, but since this is heavily implied to be a fictionalized version of real events, there's a good chance that it actually happened, and so I can't fault the story for it. I just would have liked it if they were able to make a clean break apart without needing her to die. It's the same thing with how Clara left Doctor Who. She had to die because they couldn't separate without one of them being gone. Though here, it's not a noble sacrifice, it's just senseless. Which makes her feel all the more real. I also like how her doesn't have a name, because it doesn't matter. We know who she is just from what the narrator tells us about her, and we know what she does to the narrator over the course of the story. But when it comes to names, I think the most interesting is John Miller. His name, the name that the narrator gives him, is the Disaster, which tells us a lot about the narrator. John Miller, the southern party animal who is always looking for something to ruin, no regrets or remorse, is what the narrator defines as disaster. I think that is the most utterly brilliant aspect of the book, because right there, once we learn about John Miller and his deal, we find out what the narrator thinks is a disaster. That is our benchmark for disaster. Not crazy unhealthy relationships, not drug abuse and overdoses and parties and cocaine. John Miller is what the narrator defines as disaster. And that tells us so much, and it's such a small aspect. But names are very telling, especially in a book like this, where most of the major characters don't have names. In fact, there is very limited naming in this. Most people just have titles based on their purpose to the plot. The soap opera doctor, the psychiatrist, the shrink, the animal. The only people with real names are Martin, who is presumably Patrick Stump, Fall Out Boy's lead vocalist, cause his middle name is Martin, who is one of the people very extremely worried about the narrator's well-being, even when the narrator himself isn't. He is the voice of reason. We also have her other boyfriend, Robert, who she brings to the show near the end. He's important because he is the last straw in not only their relationship, but also her life. Overall, we get a wide array of characters in the book through the band's rise to fame, but the most important to note, I think, is the disaster, because it shows the power of how names can explain characters even more than exposition can. The action is very stream of consciousness, and it can be hard to find your footing in it if you aren't prepared for it. It took me a few chapters to really start connecting with the text, but once you do, it's a pretty easy read. It partly reads like a memoir of a rock star, but obviously without mentioning any names, so it has to be taking place in a fictitious world, cause celebrities love to name drop other celebrities. It's, as I said earlier, very similar to Fight Club in that regard, and even more so in the sense that it took me a while to get the hang of deciphering the story. The story is written in a way that we go logically from point A to point B, but it feels almost like reading scattered journal entries. It's like the difference between a constructed, scripted video, like this one, and the vlog. Sure, a book is usually scripted out with logical beginnings, middles, and ends, but sometimes you can get something like this, which reads like the ramblings of a crazy person, but somehow you can't imagine it being done the other way. If this was done in third person, it wouldn't have felt right. It wouldn't have had the impact that it does. The style really enhances the experience of the book, putting us right in the middle of the narrator's various issues. Once you get into it, you won't want to put it down until the end, because you're really going to want to see where the story goes. The book is good, though like the title suggests, it's a bit of a downer, especially with the ending. Wentz is a decent enough writer, and the story is compelling enough that once you get into it, you'll want to see it through to the end. It leaves you feeling like you've just read the intimate writings of someone who wrote down the tragic events that he just lived through. And perhaps that's exactly what this is. There's no confirmation to my knowledge, though. It's a very interesting take on the mind of a musician, almost as if it was a memoir, but we get the type of stories that are usually reserved to have taken place over the course of decades with all the sex, drugs, and rock and roll this book has. I'd have to say, if you're a fan of Fall Out Boy or Pete Wentz in general, I recommend it. But who am I kidding? If you're a fan, you've already read it. If you're not a fan, but what I said sounds vaguely interesting, give it a shot. I didn't expect to like it either, and I was pleasantly surprised by it. And that was Grey. Was it good? Well, yeah. Going in, I figured I'd hate it because I don't like emo pop punk bands from the early 2000s. So naturally, a book written by a member of one about a maybe fictional one would be pretty low on my enjoyment list. But it was actually really good. Hell, it made me care about a character that we didn't even get a name for. Really, it's rather amazing for what it is. I don't know if people call him a brilliant writer for his lyrics, but they should definitely call him a brilliant writer for this book. I thoroughly enjoyed reading the book, between the naming and the lack of names and the way that even though this is all coming from one person, every character is distinct, and it doesn't feel like a recounting of events, even though it is, makes a good start to Patreon-sponsored book reviews. I can only hope that all of them will be like this. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of the Literary Lair, you can hit that subscribe button, and if you have any comments or complaints about the video, you can put those in the comment section below. Oh, and if you want to be notified of new uploads, you can hit that bell icon. And if you enjoyed this video, show it to your friends and share it around the internet. And maybe consider supporting the show on Patreon. I hope the patron enjoyed the review as much as I enjoyed the book. And remember, slots are still open for both tiers for the two shows. See you next time for the start of a 2-week Star Trek event to commemorate the newest Star Trek television series and the Next Generation's 30th anniversary, starting with a look back at the last time Star Trek was on the small screen. With an unnamed woman, only referred to as her. Huh. Fuck. There's no confirmation to my knowledge, though.